Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. Today we're going to look at position 29 of the Complete Chess Endgame course, and I'm quite excited about this position for the simple fact that we're going to start as white to move, which is really simple, and then we're going to go to black to move, which is actually kind of a lot of cool complex lines, and we'll see how a simple position like this can actually end up having a lot of subtlety. Alright, so if we look at it from white to move, basically white's plan is obviously to queen this pawn. Now, in these kind of general positions where black has a rook and a king versus a pawn, a rook and a queen on white side, then normally if white can get his pawn to the 7th rank and get his rook out, then he's going to queen the pawn and win. If black can prevent that or somehow find a resource to keep checking white, or basically make it complicated, then he'll be able to draw. So in this position specifically, white can play d7, and if black tries to pin it, white just moves the rook, moves the king to the 8th rank, and then basically black has to give up the rook for a pawn, or he's going to queen. Another line would have been if black, instead of after d7, if he played rook to d4, then we'd simply get rook move anywhere basically, and then another trade. So we know that white is going to basically play d7 and move the rook and queen the pawn. That's his plan. So in these kinds of positions, since the black king cannot reach the 6th rank yet, although he's attacking the pawn, black basically needs to try to check the king perpetually. So the move rook to g4 is rated as the best by the computer. I think the simplest plan in terms of a human's understanding would just be to play rook to h4, and then if white played d7, he could just keep checking, and he would get a draw. Otherwise, if he tries to move, then, for example, here, then black would actually win. All right, so that would be a mistake, too, to play d7 if he plays rook to h4. But rook to g4 is a little more accurate. Even if he does play d7, then we have a slightly more accurate play by black because he can play king to f6, protecting the rook. And now if this rook moves, he'll just take the pawn, for example, like that. And that would be a draw, solving all of his problems. But and also if white tries to play here, for example, then he actually gets checkmated. So that's a nice trick to know. But basically, he just has to give up that pawn. All right, so he doesn't have to play d7. If we see rook to g4, white actually has his own trick to play rook to e8. And now, actually, if you do rook to g7 check, there's a discovered check, attacking the rook and checking the king. So if the king comes in, then actually after rook to e7, black would be lost because this pawn is going to be able to make its way through. Obviously, he doesn't want to trade because then he would just take and then bring the pawn closer to queening. Instead, we'd see something like back, check, and white would just further advance the pawn. Now, black does have a trick here, playing rook to h1, threatening to win the queen and getting a draw. But actually, after check and then rook to h7, which actually prevents the check and gets a queen against a rook and endgame, which you'd have to know how to win. It's quite complicated, but technically it's winning, so we'll just go with that. From this main position, if black plays rook to g4, and then we look at the line rook to e8, black does not want to play rook to g7, but so what does he do? Well, basically he just plays a waiting move. Now, these kind of moves are hard to find over the board, I'll admit that. But the main idea is that white with rook to e8 still wants to play d7. Still a big problem. And then if we do see check, then the white king can escape to the 8th rank, and black has a real problem. So what he'll do in this example would just be to play king to d5, basically keeping the king on this pawn. And now actually he is ready to check and bring the rook over and win this pawn. So if white plays pawn here, then actually we can check, And obviously if the king goes anywhere else, we just take the pawn. But if he plays here, then the king can actually come in and we win this pawn because now the rook can't defend the pawn, and we'll win it and get a draw. So another important line to know. There's a lot of lines from this position. I basically covered all the main ones. I would encourage you to go through them. If you had a specific question, leave it in the comments below. But this main position is very educational because you will get a position where there's a main file, either a D or an E file pawn, versus the king and the rook that are in front of you, but for some reason your rook's not able to check, and those kind of moves, they lead to losses. You really need to know the main ideas before you end up playing these positions. Otherwise, you're going to drop a lot of half points or full points not knowing the main ideas. And an example of that would be here to not know to bring the rook over to check, and just playing something like check because you don't know what to do. And that's why these rook endings are so important. All right, so very complicated when it comes down to it. Hopefully I covered everything so that you have a comprehensive understanding of this specific position. And I'll see you in position 30. We're making it up there.